All right. Benzos and Meth, you in the right place? Oh, Woo Girls. Okay, I didn't know we were doing Woo Girls. Okay. It's 2:02. You're here or you're somewhere else? Okay, awesome. Well, I don't need to do the prologue. That was kind of nice to be able to do my whole kind of spiel earlier than that. But I want to be respectful of everyone's time. I'm going to make sure that we cover a lot of stuff. I guess I probably didn't say it earlier. I speak really quickly. It's kind of my thing. Yeah, I know. Welcome. I know. Please feel free to ask questions along the way. This is how we all learn. But you'll have to raise your hand and kind of freak flag-ish because I won't see you otherwise. Okay, so we're going to move right along. Harm reduction is no place for ego. It's a place to forget what you think you know and set aside your opinion so that when you meet people where they're at, you can take the time to ask them where they want to go. Right? We're walking with folks for a healthier and safer them today. So that's the bubble in which we are here at this large complex. There's a common misconception that people who inject don't care about their health. We actually talk about it every day in every way. People who inject are actually big old healthcare nerds. We talk about endocarditis, necrotizing fasciitis, HIV, hepatitis C, osteomyelitis, right? If you are a nurse in particular, you will love people who inject drugs because there's so much to talk about. Now, people who inject drugs and healthcare providers have a very tumultuous relationship. I can't be the first person that's ever told you that. People in Denver who are unhoused or inject think they're going to be warrant checked in the emergency departments. That's false. That's a HIPAA violation, right? But that doesn't speak to their relationship with healthcare, to law enforcement. That speaks to their relationship with healthcare providers, that they think healthcare providers hate them so much that instead of boop, 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 checking them in, they think they're calling and warrant checking them. So a lot of times folks don't reach out for quality healthcare. A lot of times my folks have abscesses, which is actually bacteria and kind of skin pockets on the outside of the blood. That's better than being in the blood. Sometimes they're lanced without anesthesia because if it hurts enough, you'll stop doing drugs. Well, actually what happens is the next time they have an abscess, it's lanced in my bathroom at my agency, and if I don't allow that, they do it underneath a bridge. I've seen 9 seasons of Grey's Anatomy, so sometimes I'm the one doing bandage stuff in the bathroom with people, and that's not a good look for anybody, right? So we want to talk to folks about a healthier and safer them. And anytime you break your skin, you're at risk of infection. One swipe of the alcohol pad will keep folks out of the emergency department for costly skin tissue infections. We know Denver emergency departments pay out about $6,000 a day for skin tissue infections for IV antibiotics that can be totally prevented by the swipe of an alcohol pad. And a lot of times, though, is the way you're initiated is the way that you inject your entire career. So if people don't talk about those alcohol pads, you don't know. And if you don't know, you don't know. So there's more. So there's about 5,000 known injectors in the city of Denver, an additional 6,500 in the surrounding counties. There's no incentive to out yourself as someone who injects unless you're at a syringe exchange program. Stigma and shame have been very clear about that. So why do people inject, right? No one just picks up a syringe and says, today's the day I'm going to start injecting and it's going to be magical. Right? Usually folks are hanging out sharing a bag of cocaine. Let's say Bob and I are hanging out sharing a bag of cocaine per the use, right? Bob snorts his half up. I only need a little bit to inject with. He's going to look at me and he's going to say that looks like a bigger, better high and more economical, and to show him how. So we talk about not modeling in front of non-injectors so you don't even get asked. We also know that oxys are running 50 cents a milligram on the streets of Denver. One 80 milligram pill is $40. $40 will keep you well on heroin a lot longer than that. So while it's a national shift, that's also what we see locally. And then also feeling like the odd one out. I recently got on Facebook. I know exactly what that's like. Fun facts about syringe access programs: they reduce injection-related diseases such as HIV and hepatitis C. It improves public safety. The state health department tells people to put used syringes in a coffee can, wrap them in duct tape, and put them in the dumpster. Nobody feels good about that, right? Mine are incinerated, but they also do have large syringe disposal kiosks that are 24/7 in the communities now. If you've ever been in New York City, you've bumped into them all over the place. Denver currently has 5 in outdoor areas. It's also an issue, the barriers to disposal are also an issue for homeless diabetics, because it's very difficult for them in a shelter to go up and say, here are my used syringes because I'm a homeless diabetic. And of course people are like, oh, sure. right? So they get that same stigma and shame that people who are injecting meth or heroin get, and so a lot of times they'll flush them down the toilet or inappropriately disposed too. Protection of law enforcement, we talked about that earlier. Taxpayer money savings, the average person is living 25 plus years with HIV, which is really great. However, my needles cost a dime. And evidence-based, there's not many more rigorously tested things besides syringe access programs about how they're evidence-based, and harm reduction actually increases public safety, and we can talk about that in a little bit. Data nerds, I have a little data for you. We've had 9,268 folks sign up with us. We see between 150 and 180 people per morning being proactive about their health. No one's mandated to come to a syringe exchange program, which I'm very appreciative of. They want to be there. We've done 127,821 syringe access episodes. It's every single time we're engaging with folks, creating that relationship. They can dispose properly of used syringes, access to sterile syringes, and do you want to talk to staff today about Medicaid enrollment, mental health, substance use treatment, naloxone? 61,873 times they said yes, right? And that's the point. We want to engage them right away. We're about 50-50 at heroin and meth injected most upon intake. Meth never went anywhere. Don't believe the lies. Meth has always been around. Meth's not back. Meth was here, right? But a lot of times, you know, especially on 60 Minutes and things like that, we were really talking about opioids and heroin in particular. Meth is used a lot of times for folks that are unhoused in the winter who don't want to go into shelters or don't have access to shelters. So they inject meth so they can walk around the city and not lay down and freeze to death. Injecting meth in particular in our community is their survival method. So when we're talking about meth, also I really appreciate the woman that spoke before me about trauma. Meth makes you feel really awesome. And when you don't feel great, if you have clinical depression or life's just not going your way, sometimes you just want to feel great, right? Like a super person, superpowers. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about meth. Drugs do things for a lot of people, you know? We have folks that are schizophrenic and have schizoaffective disorder. They use heroin because nothing dulls the voices quite like heroin. You know, so people know, nobody knows them better than they know themselves, but it's really talking with them. Most of the time when you hear about meth information, it's usually coupled in pamphlets for men who have sex with men. So there's been a lot of misinformation in general out there about meth, which is why we came up with these zines to get good information out there for folks, because there's a lot of misinformation and people need factual health information to be able to protect themselves. We have 72% of our folks identify as male. We've really cornered the market at 25 to 34-year-olds. 30% of our folks are housed, 29% unstably, meaning shelters, and then 51% homeless, that's primarily street homeless. You can't use in the shelters, and most of the overnight men's shelters don't usually have doors on their bathrooms because of all that injecting and overdosing, but also that can be a dignity issue for some folks too. 91% of our folks have never been to a syringe access program before. 76% heard about us from a friend. It's hard to walk into a party by yourself. Imagine walking into the exchange. 21% are Hep C positive upon intake, 3% are HIV positive. And the 3% that are HIV positive are usually out of care. Because every time they go into care, they're like, you know what you should do? Stop using drugs. And you're like, no, great. So when we're having those conversations with people and saying, what does care look like for you? How can we get you in there? Maybe we can talk and advocate with another healthcare provider. So a lot of times it's a lot of mini conversations that are happening once everyone's feeling trusted. So I'm going to skip ahead. Hepatitis C is up in the state. I do believe that has to do with injecting water. All drugs need to be made as blood-like as possible to inject. When you don't have access to sterile water, it doesn't mean that you don't inject. It means you use toilet tank water, river water, or saliva, ideally in that, right? If I have injecting water and I'm Hep C positive and I let you use my injecting water, that's how you can get hepatitis C. Hepatitis C lives in injecting water for 62 days. So they know not to share the syringes. They know that, right? But the cookers, the cottons, the tourniquets, the waters, that's a lot of times where folks get hepatitis C. This is the magnification of a needle before use, after one use, and after 6 uses, it starts to curve and shred. If you don't have a syringe access program in your community, it doesn't mean that folks aren't injecting. It means they're injecting with that one. And Wyoming, well, Wyoming, I'll tell you, they don't have people who inject. Wyoming had a, I see you, Wyoming. Wyoming had a huge Hep B/C outbreak, and what happened was is you purchase drugs and use drugs in the same places because it's so rural, right, and usually somebody's home, and they had a cup of water that was right here, and so you not only would use the water to draw up with your, to make your drug as blood-like as possible, but also before you took your used syringe away, you would wash it out in there. So did 50 or 60 other people. So we have those conversations with folks, and I mean, like, a lot of folks don't know how hepatitis A, you know, the difference between hep A, B, and C, right? A and B have a vaccination, C doesn't. So there's just a lot of misinformation. We grew up in the HIV generation where it was on MTV and you heard all this information, but hepatitis C can be really difficult. Okay, I'm not going to bore you with that. Let's just like get right here for a second. I got into harm reduction to enable people who use drugs to protect themselves and their communities from HIV and hepatitis C and overdose, to feel like they have someone to talk to, someone who cares, someone who respects them and their humanity, to ask for help and to help others in turn, to find drug treatment and health care, to reconnect with their families and rebuild their lives, and to take personal responsibility for their health and their futures. If that makes me an enabler, I'm proud to claim that term. We're enabling folks for a healthier and safer them today. Whether or not, whatever they're going to do tomorrow morning, right? If I can get them into treatment, it's not usually today, right? It's going to be at least be a couple days. But there's something positive and healthier and safer that folks can do today. We are in the midst of a fentanyl overdose epidemic, as you can see here. Meth and cocaine, and then cocaine also, crack overdoses. And then you could see here too, for the state of Colorado, prescription opioid overdoses are going down, but heroin and stimulant overdoses are going up. Sometimes when we talk a lot about data, it's hard to just be able to say, like, these are 18 of my participants that died of very public overdose deaths in Denver in the last 4 years. Whole Foods, King Soopers, under a viaduct, in a car in Capitol Hill, right? All of them were loved. I know because I definitely love them. Risk for overdoses, we talked about that. Naloxone, we talked about that. Don't worry, we're getting to meth and benzos. That's how I got you, though. You know what I mean? I know what I'm doing here. Okay. This is our overdose memorial wall. 95% of these folks we lost in our community due to overdose. When folks didn't have access to naloxone, it doesn't mean they didn't try. How many times in a movie have you seen somebody throwing somebody who's overdosing in a shower? Or stick ice up their ass or something like that, right? If you don't know, you don't know. You know, naloxone works. So we want to make sure that everybody is carrying it in the state of Colorado. People living in chaotic drug use tend to be more successful at making positive changes in their lives if they first have their most basic needs met, like food and shelter, access to health care, meaningful connection, and being treated with dignity, regardless of whether or not they continue to use drugs, and not contingent on if the difficult circumstances in their lives have changed. So I don't talk about addiction. I talk about chaotic drug use and non-chaotic drug use, problematic drug use and non-problematic drug use. Okay, all right, meth here, it's happening. So what happened was, right, we talked about that misinformation that folks have. So we went to our People Who Inject Drugs Advisory Committee, where we talk about what's going on in the community, what's going on in the agency, and how we can push forward together. And they said that they were struggling because there's a lot of misinformation. And somebody who, like a heterosexual couple that might be in a relationship, because if you're an unhoused woman, you usually have to couple up with a guy. There's a lot of DV stuff that'll happen sometimes too. So some of my young women are injecting meth, who are unhoused, walk around the city all night, right? Come into my place and sleep in the morning so they could find a little safety, because we all deserve safety. And so they were finding safety, but they're not picking up the pamphlet of MSM and meth use and understanding what's happening with meth in our community. And this is not your mother's meth, people, I can assure you. Okay, so we have artwork in here. All the artwork is done by people who inject drugs. And then all of the content was written by users, for users, with a medical professional and other professionals involved. So it's going to be really small and okay. So what is meth? What are we talking about here? It's a central nervous system stimulant. They act by facilitating the release of noradrenaline. Oh, great. Here we go. Dopamine and serotonin from nerve terminals in the brain, as well as by inhibiting their uptake. This increases the concentration of neurotransmitters and increases stimulation of receptors. So if you're a really big drug nerd, like, you know, raise your hand if you want to add something. Okay. So the history of meth, right? And we know that it was definitely used in World War II. There have been negative side effects, but also meth can be prescribed. An amphetamine type stimulant is on the rise in every sector of the world. So a lot of times, like, you won't see, like, Canada didn't really deal with meth until probably about in the last 10 years. So they were primarily cocaine, crack, and heroin. So specifically what's happening here, like I said with the data nerds before, we're about 50-50 at heroin and meth injected most upon intake. It used to be 90% of my folks were heroin users. Now, part of the issue is that if you're a meth user, some of the paranoia would not have you go into a syringe access program because they think either the cops sit out front and profile, and in other states the cops do sit out front and profile, or they think syringe access providers are the cops, because why would we lure them in with syringes and be nice to them if we didn't want to arrest them, right? So a lot of that paranoia has happened over the years. So sometimes it's like, I don't know if I've seen an increase in meth users, or if people finally, like marketing, had to hear about us 7 times and then come in to find out that we had a lot more going on, and especially that exemption card, which allows them to carry sterile and used syringes in the state of Colorado. So there's different routes of administration. So you can smoke it now, and which is the way that most people start, right? But when you smoke drugs, you are smoking away your money. So if you are using for any period of time and you're building a tolerance, of course you're going to start injecting. It's cheaper. It's more economical. We also know that people are booty bumping it. They vaporize it, eat and swallow it, snort it. It's a little trickier to snort it here, and then injecting. We do not encourage people to muscle or skin pop. That happens a lot for folks who may have blown out their veins at some point or another. It can be really difficult to absorb. You can muscle and skin pop heroin, but you can't do that with stimulants. Okay, the effects. So among the people who inject drugs, who talked about the positive effects, neutral effects, and negative effects. So positive effects were decreased appetite for some people, decreased need for sleep, so safety and survival, like we talked about, emotional regulation, energy, euphoria, feelings of higher focus and functioning, increased sex drive, stimulated pleasure and reward centers, and thought acceleration. Neutral was decreased appetite, disinhibition, and sweating. People are like, oh, they're neutral about the sweating. And then negative is anxiety, compulsive redosing, decreased appetite, so that can be a positive and a negative, decreased circulation, dehydration, increased blood pressure, heart rate, breathing, body temperatures, irritability, teeth grinding, jaw clenching, and temporary loss of consciousness, called overamping. So stimulants, there's a lot of information out there that, why people think they can't overdose on stimulants is it's more of an overamping, and so stimulant overdoses present more as a heart attack, stroke, or seizure. Opioid overdoses are lack of oxygen, which is why you get the blue skin tinge of the lips and fingertips and a lot of the slumping. Any questions, issues, concerns at this time? Great, okay, great, you're doing great, okay. Oh, well, all right. Interns, it's like, well, what are we doing here? Okay, overamping, okay, we talked about that. So if someone is overheating, the easiest way to cool them down is to offer them water to drink, or placing a cool wet towel under their armpits and knees, and remove as much stimulus from the environment as possible. So while people can't get high at my agency, they can be high there, and so sometimes we have held on to people in the afternoon. What we see a lot in our community are goofballs. Does anyone know what a goofball is? That's heroin and meth together. The 18 to 24-year-olds love it. Goofballs can be really difficult for folks to navigate sometimes, and so what we'll do is we'll hold them at my agency in the afternoon when other participants aren't there and staff's doing other work. We will turn off the lights, we'll turn on some nice music, we'll try to encourage them to get some sleep, because part of the issue with stimulants, and especially meth, is the lack of sleep. Yeah, sometimes it's the drug, but oftentimes it's the lack of sleep that really, increases a lot of these issues for folks. So we want to be as, harm reduction as possible, and then always water. If you're trying to engage someone, especially someone that you don't know, whether they be unhoused or someone who you suspect is in need of crisis intervention or something in the community, a lot of times what I do, my gateway is like a bottle of water, right? Engaging that folk, somebody like, hey, you doing okay? Can I, instead of just being like, hello, are you doing all right? Great, I have nothing to offer you. Cool, take care out there, right? Or, hey, you doing okay? Do you want this water? Do you need anything? Do you want to have a seat over here? Stuff like that. So we want to be able to give some like action-y items. People love action. Overamping, so what we tell people too is, so there's what the overamping will look like is the overheating, right? The increased heart rate, dehydration, sweating, the rigid or flailing limbs. We've all seen that, right? Like that, yep. paranoia, anxiety. There's a lot of mumbling. Anybody that works at a syringe access program knows there's a lot of mumbling. And I thought I was just not hearing very well, but I don't think I'm hearing very well, but people are definitely mumbling too. Try not to co-sign on that because you don't know what they're saying, right? I'm so sorry, I can't hear you. What is that? Like I get the ear closer because you don't want to co-sign on something. And we encourage people, and people who inject drugs, and especially meth users, encourage people to call 911 or get help if there's severe confusion, trouble seeing or communicating. We've seen that before, right? People can't really do much with their mouth. Drooling, frothing at the mouth, uncontrollable muscle spasms, trouble walking, staying upright or falling all over the place, difficulty breathing, stimulant psychosis, aggressive behavior. And so we're trying to say, use your best judgment. This list isn't exhaustive, but we want to make sure that folks know, when is somebody just doing them versus when should we get medical intervention involved. And because we know that overdoses are up and overamping is up for stimulant users, it's important to get information out there. So that kind of lays the groundwork about, Meth 101. And so then the community said, here's the top 10 harm reduction tips that we can be supportive to. And maybe the interns. Okay, so first one, sleep. Encourage someone to sleep. Sleep is good for everyone. If you have a place at your agency that someone can lay down and you can check on them in a little while, we always want to encourage that. Because a lot of times, especially if folks are unhoused, you're never safe sleeping outside wherever you go. There's a lot of violence that happens against the homeless, which is why a lot of folks walk all night and try to sleep during the day, but a lot of times they end up getting moved along. If smoking is your preferred route of administration, set personal limits. Smoking meth is often characterized with compulsive redosing, so set a time limit and consumption time when smoking. Hydrate and keep sugar-free gum around to stimulate saliva production. So we also give out safer smoking kits. We know because hepatitis C lives outside of the body for up to 6 weeks, people could potentially be sharing hepatitis C with a crack pipe or a meth pipe. So oftentimes we have crack pipe extensions or meth pipe extensions that people hold on to. In there is gum to remind people we want to get that saliva going, because we also know teeth are an issue. Currently, while people are using, and then when people are living a life of recovery and they have teeth issues, it's very difficult to push forward because of all the stigma and shame that people just assume people are still using. Often we see people who, former injectors, will get very large tattoos on their arm because it covers the scarring, right? Because when people are trying to live a life of recovery and people assume that they're still using, it's very difficult for them to flourish. Take breaks. Tolerance breaks can lead to a much easier come down. Avoid other substances, especially alcohol. That can dehydrate people further. Sample before slamming. Sometimes the meth you buy isn't what you think it is. Sometimes people sell bath salts. I mean, part of the problem is there's no better business bureau for drug sellers, right? So folks really don't know what they're getting access to. There are fentanyl testing strips where folks can test their drug to see if fentanyl or fentanyl analogs are present, and we are seeing it in some of our meth here. We believe that's cross-contamination on the scales. But if I'm a meth user, a stimulant user, and I'm opioid naive, and fentanyl is mixed in with my meth, I'm at higher risk of overdosing. So it's important that syringe access programs and other harm reduction organizations give out fentanyl testing strips, even if people are like, oh, I don't use heroin. It's like, you need to test your stimulants as well. Take magnesium. Apparently magnesium is known to be effective, and we want to make sure it does reduce the jaw clenching, teeth grinding intolerance, which is good. Do not skin pop or muscle, which we talked about a little earlier. But like I said, usually the way you're initiated into injection drug use is the way you inject your entire career. So sometimes, nobody just picks up the syringe, right? You ask your friend to teach you how, and sometimes they'll start injecting people that way. Well, it has to go this way towards the heart, right? So you're already having problems here. And a lot of times that's where people blow out these veins right away. I don't really want them up here. I don't want them here. But a lot of times people run out of options. And so if they're in withdrawal, they're going to try to do that muscle or skin pop. You can only get into the muscle if you have, a 1 inch, maybe a 1.5 inch syringe and a needle, but oftentimes people get only 1/2 inches or 5/16, and that's skin popping, which puts them at higher risk of getting abscesses too. A lot of information here, people. Okay, so if injecting, run your meth through a cotton filter, which you can get at your local syringe access program. Even if it melts clean, meth can contain cut that isn't what you're looking for. Filtering your meth can lead to less trips to the hospital. We ask that folks filter their other drugs as well. There's a lot of crap in drugs in general that we want to make sure are filtered out. And then to know your risk. Riskier substance combinations include mixing meth with alcohol, MDMA, and cocaine. Polysubstance use is complicated, and you need to do your research before doing so, right? Part of the problem with drinking is everything sounds like a good idea. You lose track of time, right? Then maybe you inject meth, and then you forget, and then you take a benzo later, right? So a lot of times when people are overdosing, they have, well, in Denver, over 50% of the overdose deaths in 2018 had 5 or more drugs on board. We also lose a lot of college freshmen every year to like alcohol and one pill, right? That mixing, because they're very, opioid naive, and also with a lot of the drinking in general. So, which is why we want to have more robust conversations with, especially college freshmen, but also colleges in general. Which is why most college campus security are carrying Narcan. Right. Withdrawal. So withdrawal can develop after physical or psychological dependence, and so what does that look like? Anxiety, decreased motivation, depression, dysphoric mood, fatigue, not enjoying things you once did, sleepiness or sleeplessness. So what can help is rehydration, sleep. We cannot emphasize sleep enough. If trying to avoid using, leave your dealer's number with a trusted friend and try to delete it from your contacts. We need like actiony items. Eat and drink nutritional foods, smoothies and drinks if you can. Caffeine in moderation. Potentially benzos might be a good way to be able to use the withdrawal, which will transition right into our benzo conversation. But oftentimes that can lessen the anxiety of initial crash. And then long term, they say consider periods of abstinence to lessen symptoms of withdrawal. Just a few days off can greatly lower your tolerance and reduce the negative side effects from meth. Okay. That's meth. Okay. Any meth questions before we transition into benzos? Yes. Yes. So the question was, he acknowledges there's no Better Business Bureau for drug sellers. So are participants talking to each other? Absolutely. Now, it's not usually, now it's more users are sellers as well. And by the time, part of the problem is by the time drugs get down to the street, nobody knows what they're cut with. The cartel doesn't do drugs, that's how they make the money. So by the time it gets down there, nobody really knows. And so the fentanyl testing strips has been a really nice gateway to see about the behavior change that happens that once you know what's in your drug. So for example, we knew fentanyl's here, we know it's here, right? What we care most about is if you know fentanyl or fentanyl analogs are present in your drugs, what are you gonna do about it? Right? So we give out the strips, and then when they use them or lose them, they come back and they tell us about it. We fill out a form, we fill out a lot of forms, right? And give them more of the strips. And we're finding that 99% of those folks are feeling more confident to protect themselves and others. They can reduce overdoses if they know what's in their drug. If they have, if they know that fentanyl is present, what they're doing is sometimes they're throwing their drugs away, which I thought was never going to happen, or they make sure their friend has Narcan there, or they do a little bit, they do a tester shot, or what we found from quite a few people is they tell others who are purchasing from those same sellers. Not necessarily to say either way, pros or cons, of just saying, hey, that's cut with fentanyl. And meth users are particularly fussy because they're not looking, most aren't looking for fentanyl in their meth when they're purchasing meth. So yeah, we want people to have those conversations to make sure of what they're purchasing. And a lot of times people sell drugs that aren't even drugs either. Coffee grounds. For a while we had our black tar heroin in Denver was being cut with shoe polish, dog feces at one point because it's kind of got that ticky-tacky, so there's a lot of misinformation out there, so we encourage people to have factual health information. Other questions about meth? Or drug stuff? Okay. All right. We are benzos. Okay. So we did the meth zine first, and then right after that, people were like, we need information about benzos. And in particular, this has been our most internationally downloaded zine, so it's not just for people who inject drugs, but a lot of people who use drugs in general use benzos. A lot of people have benzos and give them to other people while they're flying. So here's looking at you, kid. Okay, so we have benzos here, and then we have our people who inject drugs advisory committee. Again, Did all the artwork, written by users for users with medical professionals and others involved. I want to thank the PWID Advisory Committee. I want to make sure we're all on the same page when we're talking about benzos. I think there's a lot of misinformation out in the community, so let's just make sure. We're talking about Xanax, we're talking about Klonopin, we're talking about Valium, Ativan. And people have been very focused on the old opioids, but between 1996 and 2013, benzo overdose increased more than 500%. And I didn't mention earlier that between 1999 and 2017, in the United States, we've lost over 700,000 folks to drug overdose deaths. 700,000. Xanax is the #1 prescribed psychiatric medicine in the country with over 50 million prescriptions written each year. And improper use of Xanax results in over 125,000 ER visits annually. So introduction to benzos. So benzos, the characteristic effects are anxiety suppression, sedation, muscle relaxation, loss of inhibition, sleepiness, and amnesia. Anybody ever heard of a benzo blackout? A lot of people who are on benzos, I'll be like, hey, you were here yesterday and that was crazy. And they're like, oh, I wasn't here yesterday. And I was like, oh, no, you were definitely here yesterday, right? So there's a lot of issues that happen when people are blacked out. Short-acting benzos are typically recommended for treating insomnia or acute anxiety or panic attack disorders, while long-acting ones are recommended for the treatment of anxiety disorders. We tell people to eat their benzos if they're going to do that and to not inject them. Attempting to inject those solutions can lead to serious cardiovascular dysfunction. Some water-soluble benzos exist but are largely restricted to hospital settings. Attempting to inject non-water-soluble benzos have been reported to largely diminish the rush, as opposed to other classes of drugs like opioids and stimulants. Citric acid and vinegar are not effective methods for breaking down benzos to shoot, unlike crack. So you'd use those. People can inject crack. I need you to know that. Okay. Similarly, booty bumping wouldn't be ideal for this form of drugs because to dissolve the benzo appropriately, you need a fill that isn't advised to be administered rectally. I don't normally read these slides, but the PWID Advisory Committee was very clear that I need to get all the information correct. And I was like, all right. Harm reduction tips: avoiding overdose and dependency. It's not a good idea to try to use stimulants to wake up. That happens a lot though too. People use stimulants, especially meth, and will use benzos or heroin to come down, which actually puts them at higher risk of overdosing. So, but it would make sense, right? If you don't know, you don't know. If you've taken too large of benzos, while benzos are regularly used to come down off of stimulants and psychedelics, going the other way isn't advised. If you take too much of a benzo, we highly recommend sleeping it off and using the recovery position and laying on the ground like that in case somebody throws up, they would still be able to be alive. There's a lot of fake pills that people can buy on the internet, and a lot of those fake pills have fentanyl in there. So if you run a methadone clinic, you need fentanyl testing strips. We see a lot of people that use methadone that still buy benzos on the streets, and a lot of those benzos, like I said, are being purchased online, and those are coming up positive for fentanyl or fentanyl analogs. If folks are in a methadone clinic for any period of time, they may not be accessing their syringe access program, right? So they're probably not injecting heroin anymore because they're on methadone and flourishing, but don't have that information about benzos. And unless the methadone clinics are having very robust conversation about methadone and benzos, which maybe they are, it's really important to get that information in there, because we know that a lot of times when they do UAs, people are coming up positive for fentanyl in their UAs, and people are like, how did that happen? And probably from some of those benzos. So it's important that methadone clinics in particular, I'm trying to get us a funder in the state of Colorado to pay for all our fentanyl testing strips, which would be great. Right now they're $1 a strip, so they can be bought at btnx.com. $1 a strip can save somebody's life. Well, we've talked a lot about drug checking for fentanyl. I just want you to know that, when you drug test for fentanyl, you load up your shot, right? Or you do a little bit of the pressed pill. You put it in water. The fentanyl testing strip, let's say it's the cooker. The fentanyl testing strip is here, and it'll kind of sit in here. It takes about 3 to 5 minutes, so it's not really an unhoused thing to do, right? If you're injecting outside in alleys, in parks, or in business bathrooms, it's very difficult to test your drug behind a dumpster in an alley, right? So this is more of a houseman's game. You put it in here, and then it'll come up. And what's interesting is that it's 2 lines means it's negative, 1 line means it's positive. You know, the exact opposite of everything we've ever been taught about pregnancy tests and all the things. So it's really having those conversations with folks. The training that we do at our agency is very short, just like a 3 to 5 minute training, and then folks take those strips, and then when they come back, then we want to hear about that. So if you want to do something like this in your community, I think Sammers, are you guys doing fentanyl testing strips? Yes. CHN. You can get it from Sammers. They have templates. They have everything that you need. BT9X.com. Drug checking. Research chemicals. These are very popular on the internet. So a lot of times they say, especially to mix it up and then use it in the syringe to make sure that you are measuring out correctly. So a lot of times if people are sharing drugs, you don't, so you put in money for a bag, you go and buy it from the seller, you say, okay, here we go. Well, you don't really do anything with it dry because it's very hard to eyeball that. So a lot of times it's mixed up and then it's put in the syringe and then it's backloaded from another syringe because fairsies. Right? We want halvesies. It's got to be halvesies, and so it's really important that folks know what they're using, and especially with these research chemicals that are found online. Okay, dependence and tapering. Let's see my interns. They're extremely physically and psychologically addictive. A lot of physicians won't prescribe opioids and benzos at the same time anymore. That doesn't mean that people say, okay, dear sir, thank you so much for this opportunity. I shan't be using them together again. There's a guy on every corner. But there's not a lot of information that is happening out there too. So it's really important that we're having those conversations, and it's not always going to be at a syringe access program. It's important that healthcare providers are having that. We also know that sometimes pharmacists will cut off people's drugs, but it's not like they're like, thank you, I really appreciate that. Usually it's like, big scene in the pharmacy and then going out and trying to buy that, and guess what else is a really great pain reliever? Heroin, or he also may have benzos too. So it's important that we're having those conversations. Okay, so I gave you a lot of information about the power couple of meth and benzos. Questions, issues, concerns about people who use drugs, meth, benzos, go. Could I have hit everything? Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think we can model a lot of the sexual health conversations. I mean, it parallels a lot of times people are like, well, if I don't talk to them about the sex or the condoms, then they just won't use or won't have the sex or the condoms. But then we're raising people that have no idea how to put on a condom or aren't getting tested for HIV and hepatitis C. So a lot of times keeping information away from people makes it more dangerous. It makes them more at risk. So it's important people get really factual information. I mean, part of the problem with DARE, for example, was that when people didn't die or anything crazy happened if they smoked pot, then they're like, oh, then maybe everything I was taught wasn't right. So it's really important that folks are having those factual health information. What's interesting too is that a lot of times I get, especially about youth stuff, I've gotten multiple people that have come up to me that for some reason their CEOs and their nonprofits said, oh, we're not allowed to talk about harm reduction for folks that are under 18. It's illegal. It's not illegal. Right? It's a philosophy that you should be the keeper of your own information, and how can I support you for a healthier and safer you? And with all of the facts in front of you, how can we keep you safer and healthier, and what does that look like for you? And so part of what we also do too is for like injecting. Like if I don't want to initiate people, I would probably, if everyone in the room is snorting, I should snort too. Right? Or I should have a line to say, if somebody's like, hey, can you teach me to inject or something? And I'm like, oh, no, thank you, I don't do that anymore, or I have Hep C and I'm not interested in talking to you about this. Because if you don't have that line, then you get caught off guard, and then you're like, oh, well, maybe. Much like sex, right? When we were in high school, a lot of times they would be like, if you don't want to have sex with somebody, make sure you have that one line that you could feel confident in delivering. So the conversations are important to have with trusted adults or other peers. You know, we can do syringe exchange for folks under 18. A lot of states can't, but if I don't allow that to happen, under 18 are going to share and reuse and are at greater risk of getting HIV and hepatitis C, and especially those folks who are under 18 think they're invincible, so they wouldn't really want to be accessing me anyway. And so it's really, we're going to have that conversation. You're not going to be able to hang out in this drop-in. I don't want you to be around older folks, and I don't want them to be around you, but I want to make sure you're healthier and safer. And what does that look like for you? What does safety look like for you too? And so I think we have done a great disservice in our country in general about the conversations that we're trying to have, especially when people are younger. I mean, the war on drug users has been incredibly racist and classist for over 40 years, and we used criminalization, which did not make our communities any safer. And so we want people to have really good information, because then they can determine what that's going to look like for them and how they're going to be able to flourish. So I also think in health education classes, when I was in high school, our health education teacher showed me her own birthing video, and come to find out, not every health education class does that. It was awkward. And I don't have any kids. I don't know. So maybe there's a correlation. I don't know. Who knows? But, you know, I think harm reduction has had a messaging problem for years. Now, harm reduction has been around since the late 80s in the United States. Only recently have people found us relevant. We've been there on the front lines with people for years and years and years. Only when 60 Minutes is talking about, you know, drug use and law enforcement's like, we can't arrest our way out of it. I get more referrals to my agency from Denver Police Department than Denver Health. That's weird, right? Cops are like, here, you take them, right? Because we're all on the front lines of this together. And so it's important that we have those collaborative relationships, but also law enforcement shifting more to public health in our community. And so what does that look like for our larger community too, when like even cops are saying incarceration doesn't work? We need to be innovative, because death is not deterring anyone, and we're losing too many people. Other questions? I couldn't believe when I found out about that. Not all of you had to watch your health education birthing video. I didn't realize. I'm from Illinois. I don't know, that's an Illinois thing. Okay, smokers, this one might be for you. Then you might have extra time. If you have any questions, issues, concerns, please feel free to email me at lisa.harm.reduction@gmail.com. If you want to tour a syringe exchange program, talk to Samers, talk to myself, especially if you're in Denver. Yes, all the way in the back. Oh, btnx.com for the fentanyl testing strips. Great. Thanks for having me today.